Hello everyone and welcome to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series where we take a look at Precon decks and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet and today we'll be looking at the Virtue and Valor Precon from Wilds of Eldraine and its face commander, Ellivere of the Wild Court, which we'll be bringing up from its roughly $40 price point to an increased budget of $75 after upgrades. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds, or use our newly acquired affiliate link with Game Nerds in the description below if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, singles, accessories, or any of their wide selection of other TCGs and board games at the lowest prices around, while helping out the channel as you do so. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commanders we'll be covering next, and what commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Ellivere of the Wild Court is a human knight that costs 2 and Selesnya and has the following 2 abilities. Firstly, whenever Ellivere enters the battlefield or attacks, she creates a virtuous role token attached to any other target creature we control, which grants it +1/+1 for each enchantment we control. And secondly, whenever an enchanted creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card. Breaking down her core stats, Ellivere is sporting a mid-size CMC, an average stat block for her cost, and a pair of abilities that not only enable her to continually create enchantments in the form of auras, but also serves as a payoff for those and other enchantments via empowering our creatures and generating repeatable card advantage. Taking a closer look at her first ability, the unique virtuous role she creates essentially serves as a free, once per turn ethereal armor she can distribute to creatures other than herself, instantly making her a very powerful enchantment payoff that we always have access to from our command zone that can not only turn even our smallest creatures into beatsticks in any enchantment-heavy build, but on every subsequent turn can continue to grow our board and further empower our previously enchanted creatures by putting more enchantments into play, which then also procs any enchantment ETB effects we may have in play for even more value, all at no mana cost. This then leads nicely into her second ability, which turns all the creatures enchanted by the role she gives them or through other means into repeatable sources of card advantage, which, considering the easy access our colors have to flying or trampling creatures, as well as ways to grant creatures those keywords or other forms of evasion, allows us to easily replenish our hands turn after turn via a source we'll always have access to from our command zone. So, as we can see based on her abilities, Ellivere is clearly an Enchantments Matter commander with a particular focus on auras, seeking to use auras as a means to empower our board and continually generate us card advantage. And as one might expect, the base build has a solid selection of tools that allow her to do just that, such as a wide selection of old and new auras we can use to empower our creatures and or generate value, a decent selection of evasive or trampling creatures to enchant and proc Ellivere's draw, or alternatively, ways to grant our creatures trample or make them evasive to kill 2 birds with 1 stone instead, and of course, a typical selection of enchantment and aura-themed support pieces to ensure we can pad our core stats and generate even more value as we play into our game plan. There are, however, a few areas that we can improve on to refine the core build's game plan even further, such as building up the base build's incredibly low number of removal pieces so we can disrupt our opponent's plays more reliably, lowering the build's overall curve with cheaper creatures and auras to ensure we have the enchanted creatures necessary to be enabled by our commander when she comes down, and adding in even more ways to make our creatures harder to interact with to ensure that, once we've loaded them up with auras, they'll be able to stick around for as long as possible to deal maximum damage and generate maximum value. And then, coupled with some additional generic enchantment support pieces to give one last power boost to the build, we'll be left with a deck that's capable of delivering one enchanted beatdown to our opponents that they won't be forgetting anytime soon. So let us make our way deep into the Wilds of Eldraine, where we'll find Sir Ellivere, surrounded by her woodland friends, continuing her quest to discover the cause of the wicked slumber as commanded by the new High King Kennereth. And while admittedly strange, seeing a Knight of the Realm surrounded by all manner of oomphs, bunnycorns, fairies, bumblesheep, and countless other woodland critters, Sir Ellivere herself does not seem to mind at all. In fact, she seems very much to be enjoying herself, as her strange connection to nature makes her feel more at home in the enchanted wilds of her kingdom than behind the stone walls of its cities. But even so, she cannot bear to see the kingdom's people suffer as more and more of them succumb to the eternal sleep of the wicked slumber. So she continues to trek deeper and deeper into the undiscovered wilds to unravel this mystery, with her host of adorable woodland squires at her side to guide her way. So, now that we have a better understanding of the commander and playstyle, let's take a look at the cards we'll be keeping from the base build. Starting with the creatures we'll be retaining from the base build, we'll mainly be focusing on hanging on to its cheaper members that either provide on-theme core stat improvements, or alternatively are just decent bodies to enchant with auras. In the former camp, Jukai Naturalist and Starfield Mystic will both be staying in as staple enchantment cost reducers to help speed up our mana base for our most common playmakers, as will Sanctum Weaver, who instead just provides us with a potentially insane amount of ramp that scales with the amount of enchantments we have in play that we can use to cast any of our spells. Transcendent Envoy and Danitha Capuchin Paragon will then also be hanging on to their positions as aura-specific cost reducers, which again is very useful here considering that just over a quarter of our deck is comprised of auras to improve the rate at which we can cast them even further. That also, thanks to their built-in keywords, also double as solid bodies to load up with auras and crack in with. Then moving on from ramp to draw, Setessan Champion and Eidolon of Blossoms both make the grade as fantastic sources of repeatable card advantage that proc every time an enchantment ETB is under our control, not just when we cast them, thereby allowing our commander and other sources of enchantment tokens to proc them as well, as does Tanglespan Lookout, who does the same for auras specifically and will be running for the same reason. And then to wrap up our card drawing creatures, Core Spirit Dancer will be hanging on to its spot as another aura-themed source of card advantage that may not proc off the rolls our commander creates, but more than makes up for it by being a fantastic body to load up with auras to make it bigger and bigger with each aura we attach to it. And Nick Nakoof will be retaining its position as a solid late-game card that we can pump a lot of mana into to not only grow into a massive beatstick that we can then further enchant, but also allows us to dig through our deck for more auras and cheat them into play as we do so on any target for even more value. Then switching gears from core stat improving creatures to more generic enchantment payoffs, the token creating Archon of Sun's Grace and Ajani's Chosen make the grade as means for us to grow our board as we cast our aura spells and create our roll tokens to ensure we always have bodies to enchant, with the former's built-in evasion also enabling it to more easily get in for damage to proc Ellivere's draw, and a Destiny Spinner will also be staying in as yet another token creator that this time can make potentially gigantic bodies that scale off the number of enchantments we have in play, while also making our creatures and enchantments uncounterable to help us combat against control-heavy builds. Then pivoting to aura-specific payoffs that made the cut, the Legend Siona Captain of the Peleus will remain in the build to provide us with even more token creation as we attach our auras to our creatures, a free dig for an aura as she comes into play, and, thanks to a certain new addition we'll be adding, serving as one half of an infinite combo that will generate us infinite tokens for us to take over the game with. The new Umbra Mystic will keep its spot thanks to turning every single one of our auras into totem armor to make our enchanted creatures even harder to remove. Eidolon of Countless Battles makes the grade thanks to being a decent aura and enchantment payoff to further fuel our primary game plan, and Timber Paladin will be hanging on to its spot as our last retained aura payoff creature, thanks to being an excellent body for us to load up with auras that, when combined with the final build's various means to protect our creatures, can easily end up growing into a gigantic trampling beatstick that our opponents will be unable to interact with. And then to wrap up our kept creatures, The build's alternate commander, Gilwain Casting Director, will be holding on to his spot as an easy-to-proc source of auras via the rolls he distributes to both proc our enchantment's matter payoffs and grant rolls to creatures that our commander can't get to due to being limited to procking only once per turn. Shalai Voice of Plenty stays in as a powerful source of AoE targeted removal protection that, once we're able to get a protection aura on her, can make our board very difficult to interact with outside of wipes, while also being an easy source of evasive damage to proc Ellivere's draw. And Sun Titan will be staying in as well, thanks to the final build's lower curve, allowing it to hit the vast majority of our creature base and auras to be used again as they're inevitably destroyed to ensure they don't remain in our bin for long. Then proceeding to our kept instance, the only two included in the base build, Swords to Plowshares and Generous Gift, will of course be keeping their spots as both excellent removal spells and one of the few ways this deck has to interact with our opponents out of the box. Similarly, our retained sorceries will consist of only a handful of entries as well, with the solid reprint Retether staying in as a relatively cheap means for us to reanimate all our destroyed auras from the bin to instantly supercharge our board in the late game, the reanimation spell Unfinished Business staying in as even more reanimation, this time for both creatures and auras to help us bring back our best body and our best auras to enchant it with from our bin for a second round, and the aura-themed board wipe Winds of Wrath rounding out our kept sorceries by providing our build with a mostly one-sided wipe that our enchanted creatures can survive while the blockers in their way are reduced to dust, clearing the way for them to swing in for maximum damage and to generate considerable card advantage alongside our commander. And then reaching the arguably most important category in this build, our kept enchantments, we'll be focusing our efforts on hanging on to the auras with the lowest cost that give us the most benefit in order to keep our curve nice and low, allowing us to get more of them into play faster to enable our commander. For example, in order to further improve our core stats, Utopia Sprawl and Fertile Ground will both be staying in as very cheap on-theme ways for us to get more mana out of our lands while increasing our enchantment count, as will Bear Umbra, which serves as a more traditional aura that empowers and protects our creatures, but also effectively doubles our mana each turn by untapping our lands as we swing in to ramp us considerably. Then on the card advantage generating side of things, Snake Umbra stays in as a simple on-damage source of repeatable draw that works nicely alongside our evasive creatures and evasion granting auras to reliably get in for damage to proc its and our commander's draw. Sage's Reverie makes the grade as both another aura payoff that empowers our creatures and a draw source that scales off the number of auras we have in play. And a Songbird's Blessing hangs on to its spot as a repeatable source of drawing/cheating auras into play each turn as we swing in, which again lends itself nicely to our evasion and evasion granting sources to help generate us even more value turn after turn. Enchantress's Presence will then also be staying in this category as one of the few non-aura enchantments we'll be running, giving us one more means to generate card advantage as we cast our plethora of enchantments, this time from the relative safety of our back row. And then as our last core stat improving enchantment, Kenrith's Transformation will be keeping its spot as a very solid or a base source of removal that effectively transforms any creature, including our opponent's commanders, into a paperweight by transforming them into a vanilla 3/3, thereby bypassing destruction protection while keeping it on the field to prevent it from being recast or reanimated, making it highly effective for us and infuriatingly annoying for our opponents. Then with our core stat improving auras covered, it's time to move on to our creature empowering auras, where Ethereal Armor and Ancestral Mask both retain their positions as excellent enchantment payoffs to further empower our creatures with, the former even scaling off all other enchantments on the battlefield, not just ours, as does Mantle of the Ancients, which instead only scales off auras but makes up for it by reanimating all our auras from the bin when it comes down for even more value and power. Daybreak Coronet will then be capping off our kept aura payoffs, since it requires us to have an enchanted creature to even be able to use it, but, in return, provides a substantial stat boost and powerful keywords to an already buffed creature to allow them to hit even harder and safer while padding our life totals with every swing. And while on the topic of stat boosting and keyword granting auras, Angelic Destiny and Giant Inheritance will both be carrying over as very solid auras that grant sizable stat increases, reliable means for our creatures to get in for damage via granting them flying or trample, and, even if they're destroyed, they can generally bring themselves right back to our hand to be used again to keep the pressure up. Indomitable Might will then also be hanging on to its position as another source of evasion. The super trample it provides allowing us to always inflict maximum damage to our opponents while also granting a decent stat increase, all at flash speed if we need it. And finally, as our last aura and enchantment carryover, Timeless Ward will be staying in as a superb way for us to permanently make our commander indestructible at flash speed to ensure we can repeatedly get value out of her abilities, or alternatively, we can just use it to protect our other payoffs or empowered creatures instead at sorcery speed if we need to. Then as our only two artifact holdovers, to no one's surprise, we'll be holding on to both Soul Ring and Arcane Signet as staple ramp sources that are too good not to run for the sheer amount of cheap reliable ramp they provide any build they're in. And at last, reaching our retained land base, we'll be holding on to the Mana Lands Command Tower, Canopy Vista, Sungrass Prairie, and Fortified Village as lands that tap for both our colors that always or usually come into play untapped to provide fixing without sacrificing speed. Temple of Plenty keeps its spot as another source of both our colors that may be slow, but whose scry helps smooth out our draws, which is especially good in the early game. And lastly, Krosan Verge and Myriad Landscape will be staying in as decent sources of land-based ramp that both speed up and fix our mana base, while also getting lands out of our deck to make it more likely for us to hit gas later. Then for our kept utility lands, the absolutely fantastic reprint, Hall of Heliod's Generosity, will of course be retaining its position as a superb piece of repeatable enchantment recursion from our land slot, and Castle Ardenvale will be hanging on to its spot as an okay source of extra bodies if we find ourselves with the mana to spare, which can usually come into play untapped, so there's no reason not to run it over in other planes. And lastly, we'll be keeping 11 plains and 12 forests from the base build as our basics to round out our mana base. That leaves us with a final tally of 76 cards including basic lands that we'll be keeping from the base build, leaving us with 24 cards to replace, giving us a very solid enchantment/aura themed foundation for us to expand upon with our upgrades. So, now that we've covered all the cards that made the cut from the core build, let's move on to our upgrades. Starting off with our new creature additions, we'll be concentrating most of our efforts here on swapping out some of the base build's off-theme and or less impressive on-theme members for less expensive creatures to help lower our curve while staying on the primary enchantment and aura game plan. For example, the off-theme Stacks Piece, Tithe Taker, and the generic Mana Dork Paradise Druid will both be cut in favor of the ramp pieces Herald of the Pantheon and Composer of Spring, the former serving as another enchantment cost reducer who also passively pads our life totals, while the latter instead nets us extra land drops as we cast and create our enchantments, and eventually lets us cheat creatures into play instead. We'll then be axing the somewhat awkward to use recursion source Loamcrafter Fawn and the far too basic land tutor Sylvan Ranger, so we can add in the card advantage generating legends Shram Senior Edificer and Sithis Harvest Sand, both of whom serve as even more passive draw sources as we cast our aura and enchantment spells respectively, and sidelining the OK Aura Payoff Aura Gnarlid for the significantly better Aura Payoff legend Lightpaws Emperor's Voice, who turns every aura spell we cast into both a tutor and a cheat into play spell to greatly improve the deck's consistency and tempo. And then to round out our new creature additions, the okay but too go wide focus legend Sir Armont the Redeemer will find herself replaced by the cheaper legendary Selesnian knight Danitha Nubanalia's Light, who provides our build with yet another means to recur our auras from the bin, as well as another solid, multi-keyworded body for us to stack auras on, and the interesting but ultimately too conditional aura reanimating liberated livestock will be sent to market so we can make room for the more reliable enchantment payoff Ondu Spirit Dancer, who easily allows us to double up on all our best auras to empower our board even further, and, on top of that, is one of the few ways we can get the virtuous roll on Ellivere so she can benefit from her own role, turning her into a legitimate commander damage dealing threat. And then with our creature upgrades complete, we'll then proceed to our new instant additions, in which we'll be beefing up our removal package by getting rid of the much too gimmicky draw source Ox Drover, the far too expensive aura and creature Celestial Archon, and the off-theme board wipe Realm Cloaked Giant, so we can replace them with Path to Exile, Beast Within, and a Stroke of Midnight, all of which provide the build with more instant speed ways to deal with a variety of common threats efficiently and relatively cheaply. Then skipping over new sorcery additions, since we won't be adding any to our final build, we find ourselves at the category with the greatest number of new changes, our enchantment upgrades, where we'll be adding even more ways to fill out our core stat requirements, as well as additional means to empower our creatures even further. Starting in the former camp, the subpar ramp source Careful Cultivation will be exchanged for the much cheaper and efficient ramp source Wild Growth to help us speed up our mana curve, the underwhelming fight aura Warbriar Blessing, and the way too expensive auras Verdant Embrace and Pollen Bright Wings will be sidelined to add in the removal auras Darksteel Mutation, Lignify, and Song of the Dryads, all of which add even more ways for us to turn our opponent's creatures and commanders into lawn ornaments that they won't be able to recur or recast, and the admittedly decent board wipe Austere Command being edged out by the non-aura enchantment Grasp of Fate, which is slightly better than its predecessor in this build by virtue of being cheaper, proccing all our enchantment payoffs, and dealing with each of our opponent's biggest threats regardless of type. Starting in the former camp, then in the latter camp, the powerful but bit too expensive in this build draw source Rishkar's Expertise, the underwhelming aura recurring aura Spectral Steel, and the too slow token creating Vitu-Ghazi the City Tree will all be swapped out so we can swap in the protection and evasion focused auras Spirit Mantle, Shield of the Oversoul, and Canopy Cover, each of which provide our creatures with varying degrees of resilience against common types of removal through protection, indestructibility, or targeting protection, while simultaneously making our creatures evasive in the process, enabling said creatures to be much more viable recipients for our commander's role and other auras. We'll then also be cutting one of our spare planes to add in another protection aura in the form of Shielded by Faith, which gives us yet another way to keep our creatures alive for longer that also pulls double duty as a combo piece alongside Siona Captain of the Peleus, which is the other half of the combo that allows us to generate infinite tokens. Link to that combo in the description. And then as the last two auras we'll be adding to the build, we'll be slotting out another two planes in order to slot in the enchantment payoff All That Glitters and the trample granting and self-recurring Rancor, both of which are cheap and reliable ways to further empower our creature base. And finally, as our only other non-aura enchantment addition to the build, as well as our last new enchantment overall, we'll be swapping out one of our forests for the enchantment payoff Sterling Grove, which not only protects our enchantments from backer removal by granting them Shroud, but also serves as an enchantment tutor for us so we can search up whatever aura or other enchantment we may need directly to hand to greatly improve the build's consistency. And at last, reaching our new land upgrades, we'll simply be terraforming two more of our forests into the Painland Brushland and the Checkland Sunpetal Grove, thereby improving our mana base now that these two lands have seen enough reprints to actually make them affordable. So, now that we've covered all 24 cards that we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. This deck currently has 28 creatures including our commander, 5 instants, 3 sorceries, 28 enchantments, 2 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 34 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 38 cards that are considered or can create enchantments, 28 of which are themselves or are able to create auras, 18 cards that care about enchantments, 20 cards that care about auras, 8 cards that can either reanimate or recur our auras, or our auras that can recur or reanimate themselves, 12 auras that grant our creatures evasion, and 10 auras that can protect our creatures from targeting or removal. giving us a very solid enchantment and aura themed build with plenty of payoffs for both, alongside a decent number of ways for us to recur and protect our auras while also empowering and protecting the creatures they're attached to. Then for general deck stats, we have 15 ramp sources, 13 card draw sources, 10 targeted removal sources, and 1 board wipe. Our ramp and draw being slightly higher than normal since our curve is very low to the ground and we want to be able to cast and replenish our resources as quickly as possible, while our wipes are low since we're far more concerned about building up our board state to crash into our opponents with rather than leveling theirs. Looking at our mana curve, we have 8 1-drops, 22 2-drops, 19 3-drops, 11 4-drops, 5 5-drops, and 1 6-drop. Leaving us with an aggressive low-to-the-ground curve that aims to drop cheap bodies in the early game, load them up with equally cheap auras, hopefully ones that provide them with removal protection, and then dropping our commander on board to turn all those auras and our other enchantments into a significant power boost for those creatures, enabling them to crash in for big, hopefully evasive damage turn after turn, until our opponents finally crumble under the damage they deal and the value they generate. The final price of this build then comes out to be $75.36 after upgrades. This price does not include tax or shipping, and assumes that the price you paid for the precon was $40. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now for side grades, we can consider swapping out Herald of the Pantheon for Elvish Archivist if we'd rather have another source of repeatable enchantment-themed draw to replenish our resources, over ramp to help us cast them faster, and a Johnny's Chosen can be exchanged out for Yenna Redtooth Regent if we'd rather have a second way for us to double up on our most powerful auras and enchantments at the cost of diminishing the size of our board state. And then for upgrades, the only legitimate suggestion I would have outside of just generically good cards for our colors would be trading out the alternate commander, Gilwain Casting Director, for the equally on-brand but arguably more powerful legend, Calyx Guided by Fate, who is an enchantment himself to proc our payoffs with, takes advantage of the auras in the 99 and that our commander creates for us to further empower our creatures with counters, and, best of all, serves as a non-damage way for us to multiply any of our enchantments to get even more copies of them into play. Though considering his price has been steadily rising since his release, we may have to leave it to fate whether to buy him now before it increases further, or wait and see if there's a reprint on the horizon to tank his price. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, with the last of the precons for this set complete, we'll be switching back to our normally scheduled builds and return to working on our backlogged commanders, starting with Saramunda White Hand next week and Tom Bombadil the following week, so look forward to builds featuring them coming soon. And when we've covered both of those commanders, we'll then be moving on to covering commanders from the Wilds of Eldraine set, meaning we'll need a new poll to decide who we'll be covering next. And as is tradition, the first poll will be featuring the alternate commanders from the precon decks, those being the goading flash speed payoff Alayla Cunning Conqueror, and the role distributing Gilwain Casting Director. So please cast your votes in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders you want to see me feature in future polls. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the cut-rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.